Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Three Very Close Encounters. Sightings are very interesting, but even more interesting to me are cases in which UFOs approach very closely. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. I have three cases I think you probably haven't heard before, and each of them involve very close encounters. The first involves a group of young teenagers who were approached by a UFO and struck by a beam of light, and one of them was very nearly abducted. The second case involves four young adults who came upon a landed UFO and humanoids. And the third case involves two teenage girls and one of their mothers who were actually chased by a UFO and experienced missing time. Each of these cases has something unique, I think, to contribute to our understanding of the UFO phenomena, and that's why I wanted to do this video. So let's just get started. And the first case I call Abducted by Aliens, Almost. This case took place in 1989 in the small rural town of Mount Olive, Louisiana. The main witness is Charmaine Scott, and also her sister and friend. So how this happened was one summer evening in 1989, Charmaine, her sister, and their friend Roy were walking home along with their little dog Sheila. They had just approached Charmaine's house when something very strange happened. A UFO came swooping down right over their heads. It was a bright circular object about 30 feet in diameter. It swooped down, zigzagged a few times, and then hovered about 20 feet directly above the three witnesses. Charmaine was about 11 years old at the time, and it completely stunned her. All three of the witnesses were actually quite frightened. As Charmaine says, it was this circular light, kind of big, maybe about the size of a doughboy pool that you stand up in and swim in. It was hovering over me, and it was making this buzzing noise. At this point, several things happened at once. All three witnesses stared upwards in amazement at this object. Their little dog Sheila took off running into Charmaine's house. At the same time, Charmaine's mother appeared at the kitchen window, looked up at the object, saw it hovering over her two daughters and Roy, and she began banging on the kitchen window for them to come inside. All three witnesses turned to run, and that's when this object sent down a powerful beam of light. And the other two managed to escape this beam of light, but Charmaine was struck full on and became instantly paralyzed. As she says, I was looking up. That's all I remember, looking up. And I couldn't hear. Like my mom, I could hear in the distance, but not loud, like she was muted. It just felt like nothing, like everything was gone. I don't know, it felt like everything was okay for that one moment, like peace. I don't know how to describe it. It was just this definite feeling that everything was okay and beautiful. But I couldn't see anything. There was just this feeling. It was like I was stuck, looking up, like in a trance kind of thing. It was pleasant. It was bright, but it was pleasant. I didn't want to look down. It was a really dreamy-like state. So Charmaine feels like she was actually paralyzed, but she didn't care. All her fear, which had been so strong before, was now completely gone, and she felt really good. And while she could hear her mother screaming and her sister and Roy screaming at her, she didn't care. All that really mattered was that one moment. And she just stood there completely entranced, and the world seemed very far away when suddenly Charmaine's sister reached into the beam of light, grabbed her arm, and pulled her out. And the instant she was out of the beam of light, Charmaine's fear returned instantly, and all three children ran quickly into the house, screaming. At this time, the beam of light retracted. This object moved over the house, over the woods in the backyard, and then darted upwards really quickly, straight up into the sky, and was gone. The three witnesses looked at each other in shock. They could hardly believe what had happened. It was obvious to all of them they had seen a UFO. Charmaine's mother wanted to talk about it, but the kids did not want to discuss it. They very nearly called the police, but in the end decided not to. It was just a very shocking event. And the next day they did find physical evidence. Looking out in their backyard, where this UFO had hovered before taking off straight up, a tree had been knocked down. So they think probably this UFO caused this tree to be knocked down. None of the children had any physical effects from this encounter, but the emotional effects were long-lasting. They talked about it for quite some time, and none of them ever forgot it. Charmaine felt like she was very nearly abducted, and I agree with her. I think it came that close, and if her sister hadn't pulled her out of this beam of light, she may have been taken on board. This is one of very few cases that I've investigated or even read about where someone was able to avert an abduction from happening. So yeah, it's a very interesting case, a very close-up encounter involving this beam of light. And another interesting detail is how this beam of light caused her fear to evaporate. This is something I've heard in a number of other cases. So these are very powerful beams of light. And yeah, an interesting case with some unique elements. Second case I want to talk about, I call a UFO landing with humanoids. This took place in 1973 in San Dimas, California. There's a golf course in San Dimas, and this incident took place in the mountains just above the San Dimas golf course. It involves 4 witnesses, young adults, age around 17 to 22. There was Gary and his 3 friends, Tom, Stan, and Suzanne. These are pseudonyms. They did not want their real names used. But what these young adults would often do is hike up into these mountains above the San Dimas golf course, where there was this little valley which was not visible from below because it sort of dipped into the mountainside there and was this secret little place that they enjoyed hanging out. There was a long dirt road that switchbacked up this mountain. It was a difficult road and not easily accessible. But this is where they spent many hours just hanging out. As Gary says, we've been up there many times. It's a really tough road to get up to, so we had a really hard time getting there. But once you get up there, it's a meadow that sits back underneath huge oak trees. We'd always go up there and have a good time. On this particular summer night in 1973, they went up to this particular spot and were shocked at what they found. As Gary says, we get up around the turn and we see a bunch of lights, probably 3 or 4. They were huge and they were never there before. We pulled up to where we normally stopped. And this is when they realized that there was something at the far end of the field. And it was huge. It was much bigger than any normal vehicle, much bigger than a helicopter. Whatever it was very large. The lights that were on it were so bright that they couldn't really discern a shape. But there was what appeared to be a scaffolding around the object, and they could see the silhouettes of 3 or 4 tall figures, human-looking figures as far as they could tell. But this was clearly unusual, and instantly they could tell that this just couldn't be explained as any conventional object. As Gary says, there was something not right about it. There was no way something of that size could have ever gotten up there. There's no way that thing just dropped in there, and there were 4 figures walking along a railing. I was actually having a hard time believing what I was seeing. This thing was so bright that, they could only see silhouettes. They estimated it was about 250 feet away from them, and this object was large enough to extend across the whole field. And as Gary says, that was the thing that scared me the most. So they jumped out of their car and stood right next to it, watching this thing, trying to figure out what it could possibly be. And at first, whoever was in this object or around this object didn't seem to notice that they had an audience. And Gary and his friends were trying to figure out what these guys were doing. As Gary says, it was like they were doing normal maintenance or a routine thing. There was no hurrying, no panic in the whole situation. It's kind of weird. We stood there for a long time and watched it. We were checking things out. And then, all of a sudden, a figure started coming toward us. We could see him just walking right toward us. So Gary and his friends were a tough bunch. They didn't frighten easily, he said. But as this figure started walking towards them, they started to get really nervous, and they shouted out to this figure, "Who are you? What are you doing?" Another one of them said. "Why are you here? Who are you?" They started shouting out all these questions, and this figure did not respond. It didn't answer in any way, but continued to walk at a measured pace toward the boys. And whoever this was, they could see now that it was a very tall, very large figure, and seemed somewhat threatening and menacing, particularly because this figure was not responding. So Gary shouted out, "Something is not right about this." And his friend Stan said, "Let's get the hell out of here." At that point, Gary had walked off a short distance and was trying to get a better view. But now that this figure was coming close, all 4 of them panicked. They quickly piled into the car and took off. As Gary says, we got into the car and got out of there so fast. We went down the same small skinny road that just winds back and forth. There's no way anything like that could have ever gotten to that place. So they drove down this road as fast as they could and went straight to the police station. They found actually a police officer patrolling the San Dimas golf course in his cruiser, and they excitedly told this officer what they had seen and begged him to go check it out. And the officer could see that they were very emotionally shaken, so he agreed to go investigate. And while he drove off up this road, the boys returned to their home. And later that evening, Gary called the sheriff's station and asked for this officer. And the officer said that yes, he had driven up to this location and didn't find anything at all. So the very next day, Gary and his friends drove up to this same location that next morning. And as Gary said, there was nothing. It was wild. They found no evidence of any landing trace cases, no evidence at all that anything had been up there. But whatever it was huge. All of them are convinced that this was not a military craft of any kind. It was far too large. It was totally silent. These humanoid figures, they don't know if these were regular humans or ETs or what. But there was just too many weird things about this for it to be something normal. As Gary says, it was really scary. It was such an intense thing. It was really crazy. There was nothing fun about it. We kept on saying, "Who are you? What do you want?" And they never answered us. It was amazing. You'd think if it was military, they would have answered. That's the part that kind of gets to me. So yeah, they are convinced they came upon a landed UFO with humanoids. And I tend to agree. It's a very strange case. These two above cases I did present in my book, Wondrous. And I've got a third case that I'd like to present to you, which is also very, very strange. And I call this third case Chased by a UFO. This occurred many years ago in 1958. There are three main witnesses: Dorothy Hudson, age 16, her friend Carol, and Dorothy's mom, Dorothy Sr. And this took place in Koreatown in Southern California, specifically at the Pio Pico Library in Koreatown. And what happened is these two teenagers, Dorothy and her friend Carol, would often go to the library to hang out and have fun and read. And that's what they were doing on this evening. And their mom dropped them off at the library. And as they were going into the library, Carol happened to look up and saw this weird glowing object way, way high up in the sky. And she looked at it, and although it was very much like a star, it was much brighter than a star. And it scared her a little bit because she got the weird feeling that it was looking at her. But she didn't really know what to think. She mentioned it to Dorothy, and Dorothy saw it too, and they just kind of shrugged and went into the library, hung out for a couple of hours. The library closes at 9 o'clock. And their mom was scheduled to pick them up at precisely 9 o'clock when the library closes. And they wanted to smoke a cigarette secretly before their mom arrived, so they snuck out not snuck out, they left the library at about 10 minutes before 9 to smoke a cigarette before Dorothy's mom showed up. And this is when this object appeared. And they saw this star-like object, and suddenly this star-like object drops down out of the sky very quickly and hovers right over the telephone wires across the street. And I'll just let Dorothy describe what happened in her own words. As she says, "The library closed at 9 o'clock, and we came out of the library at about 8:45 to wait for my mom to pick us up. And as we were sitting there, we saw this light up in the sky, and whatever it was kept getting bigger and bigger until all of a sudden it came down, and it was hovering above the street over the library. We sat there and we looked at it, and we didn't know what it was. It had a lot of lights on it, and it was still. There was no noise coming from it, but the lights were moving around it. Either the lights were blinking off and on, or it was moving in a circular motion. The object was very, very big. It was huge, and we just sat there and looked at it. It was as big as a house, but it was round, perfectly round. The lights were red, yellow, and white, and they were either blinking off and on, or they were moving around like a lid on a bottle. The closest thing I've seen to it was in that movie, Close Encounters. That was the closest thing, the mother ship, but it was nowhere near that size. But that was the closest thing. When I saw that movie, I said, that looks almost exactly like what I saw when I was a kid. Carol, of course, saw it too, and gave a vivid description. As Carol says, "All I remember is we were at the library, and I saw it before we went in there, and it was really small and shiny. It was staying up in the sky, and we went into the library, and when we came out, it was still there. I don't know what it was, really." And at this point, this is when Dorothy's mother showed up. As Dorothy's mother says, "The girls were at the library, and I went to pick them up. And I saw this thing. And they said, 'Look, it's up there.' And I thought it was like a light, but it wasn't a round light, like when you look out on the horizon. It looked like a flat light. I mean, that's the only way I know how to explain it. It just kind of stayed in place. How can I explain it to you? It was like if you had a plate that was all lit up. It was shining from the top and the bottom, but it just stayed in place like it was hovering. None of them felt any fear at this point. As Dorothy says, neither one of us felt any type of fear or anything. We were just perplexed as to what it was. About 5 minutes after we saw it, it didn't move. It was just hovering over the street in front of the library. My mom's car pulls up, and so we jumped in the car, and I said, "Mom, look at that. What is that?" And she said, "I don't know what it is. It's probably a helicopter." I said, "No, it's not a helicopter. Look how big it is. It's round. It doesn't have any propellers or anything." And she said, "Well, I don't know what it is." So at this point, they start to drive home, and this is when they realize it is actually following them. And as Dorothy says, we live maybe a mile and a half from the library, and this object followed us all the way home over the car. There was no noise, no nothing. And I remember my mom, her getting a little nervous. Carol and I were sitting in the back seat, and we kept looking out at it. We pulled up in front of the house, and my mom said, "Just get out of the car and get into the house." Dorothy's mom confirms this, as she says, "I was driving the kids home, and I could hear them talking in the back seat. 'It's following us, it's following us.' But you know how mothers are when they work and they're tired. They don't pay too much attention." Carol, of course, also remembers this object following them home. And as she says, it followed us home. And when we came out, it followed us home. And when we got to her house, it was there. We could still see it. It was like it followed us home. It was weird because it seemed like it followed us home. At this point, the object zipped away, and it must have been around this time that they had missing time. And as Dorothy says, at this point now we were really wondering what the heck it was, but I never felt any fear. I don't know if my mom or my girlfriend Carol did. So we got out and went into the house. Carol came into the house with me. We came back out a few minutes later, and it was still out there, hovering way above the trees. How high, I have no idea. I was a kid at the time, so I don't know how high it was. But then, all of a sudden, like a bat out of hell, it just took off. It went whoosh. I mean, it was gone from a big object to a tiny little object in the sky, and it just went away. At that point, I went in, and I remember looking at the clock, and it was exactly 10 o'clock. Now, my mother picked us up an hour before at 9 o'clock at the library, maybe 5 minutes after 9, and it takes only 10, maybe 15 minutes to come home. And when I went back into the house, Carol and I stayed in the house about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we went back outside. There was a whole half an hour in there someplace, maybe 20, 25 minutes, where I don't know what. I don't remember anything. How did it get to be 10 o'clock so quickly? So this missing time aspect confused her, but at the time she didn't think much about it. As she says, as Dorothy says, my mom was supposed to pick us up at 9 o'clock, and Carol and I went out earlier than 9 o'clock, and she was always on time. She picked us up probably exactly at 9, and the next time I remember looking at the clock was after we got into the house, which was supposedly 15 minutes later. And after I got into the house and went running around and looking out the window and everything, all of a sudden I looked at the clock and it said 10 o'clock. And I said to Carol, "Do you know it's 10 o'clock already?" And she said, "You're kidding." I said, "No, it's 10 o'clock already." And Carol said, "Well, I'm supposed to be home at 10. I said, "Well, you better go home because it's 10 o'clock now." We didn't know what happened to the time, but we never would have thought about it that much. It wasn't until some time later, when I was older, and I talked to Mom and Carol about it, and we said, yeah, that was a strange incident. It upset Carol quite a bit, and in fact, she begged Dorothy and Dorothy's mom to watch her carefully as she walked home, which was just a few blocks away, or a few houses away, to make sure that she got home safely. So this totally freaked her out. As Carol says, I remember that we got home. I think I went in her house for a minute and then I came out and I ran on home because I remembered it's still up in the sky. And I said, I'm going home. And I ran home. I was kind of scared. It followed us home, and it seems weird that it picked on us. So it's quite obvious to all of them that they experienced a period of missing time. And this was well before, the Betty and Barney Hill case had been publicized. So they had no idea that missing time could possibly mean a closer encounter or being actually taken on board. And when they learned about missing time, they realized that this could have been a much more extensive encounter than they consciously remember. So that really concerned them. And as Dorothy says, I have no recollection of anything like that occurring, but I definitely believe in UFOs because I saw one. I saw one. It's just really strange. I don't know if I'm sure a lot of people say this, but I don't know if I'd really want to know or not, because if something like that actually happened to me, I don't know what kind of effect it would have on me if I remembered. I mean, if it happened, it's in my subconscious someplace, but I don't want my conscious part to see. I don't want to be traumatized many years after the fact. Dorothy has no idea when this missing time occurred, but presumably it was during this drive or perhaps when they stepped outside. But as Dorothy says, I never felt dizzy, I never felt ill or physically strange or mentally strange or anything like that. The UFO was low, not low enough for me to touch it, but it hovered maybe the height of 2 telephone poles, one on top of each other. First time I saw it, it was way high up in the sky. It was moving around. And when I say up in the sky, like an airplane. And we saw it come in, and it got close. But we had no sense of fear at all, maybe because we were young, or it didn't make a lot of noise or anything. Sometimes noise can scare you more than the actual visual thing. But I honestly don't think I do want to know what happened. And Carol feels pretty much the same way about this missing time and the possibility that there was an onboard experience. As Carol says, it's funny. I was thinking one day about that, and I thought, gee, I wonder if I was ever in it. Because we had seen that. They had something on television the other day. I think it was on Donahue or Oprah. And they were talking about this big thing, a spaceship. And that's when I was thinking about it, just the other day. And when I asked Carol if she was interested in knowing what happened during the missing time, she said, I don't think so. I don't want to know. One significant sort of end note to all of this is that Carol, after I had interviewed her, told me that she had actually seen UFOs before. And in fact, it was just a few months before this incident that she had a sighting. As she says, before that, I saw something in the sky. This was maybe a month before we went to the library. It was really far away and you could just barely see it. I mean, it wasn't looking at me or anything, but I could see it going through the sky. So I think maybe Carol, Dorothy's friend, may have been the actual target of this particular UFO incident. It's impossible to say without, them going under hypnosis and recalling exactly what happened. But this is a very clear-cut case of missing time involving 3 witnesses, all of who confirm and corroborate each other's details. There are many cases involving missing time, and I do suspect they probably had an on-board experience, but at this point, I certainly cannot say for sure. But at the very least, it's a very interesting incident in which this UFO followed them home, very close, treetop level, and they had missing time. So these are the 3 cases I wanted to share with you today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really appreciate you watching, and until next time, keep having fun.